the slender Mercury Redstone of the same rocket family as the Juno 1, which had sent Explorer 1 into space a few years earlier. This was the very beginning of the Mercury program, and even though Mercury was designed to place a human being into Earth orbit, the Redstone could not accomplish this. The only vehicle they had with enough power to achieve orbit was the Atlas, and it was giving them no amount of troubles. But the vehicle still had to be tested outside the atmosphere before they completed orbit. So as you raise our thrust and get our vehicle rising, much like the Juno 1, the Redstone is a single-stage, single-piece vehicle with a single engine. And it is designed to place the Mercury spacecraft into a suborbital arc, which is basically leaving the atmosphere and coming back down without achieving orbit. And this would accomplish the tasks of testing the integrity of the spacecraft as well as its systems and the ability for the astronaut to control it. So simple objectives. But there were so many unknowns in the first launches that it was no less dangerous than any other mission ever to fly. Now the first being to fly it was not a man, it was in fact a monkey. And this monkey was not given his name until after his safe return, and the name he received was Ham. But before that it was just a, shall we say, test specimen number. Of course the press wouldn't hear much about this, and it was not of too much importance. What was of importance, and not really televised, was the fact that the mission of Mercury Redstone 2 that carried the monkey was a failure. When the vehicle was pitching over and proceeding downrange, it was not following the proper trajectory. It was a bit off and increased the G-forces on the occupant inside. Even worse than that, the engine had shut down early and the abort sequence initiated, pulling the spacecraft free, and the extra thrust of the abort tower had caused the vehicle to go higher and faster than it was meant to, so on its way back down, rather than the maximum G-force of 11.5 Gs, Ham had suffered 14.9. As the engine is about to run out, and we have just barely gotten our apogee outside the atmosphere. The escape tower fires and the vehicle separates to continue its final journey out of the atmosphere, which will still take a couple more minutes. Well, because of this added G-stress, they felt it was necessary to fly another test flight after the problem was corrected to ensure there would not be any harm done to the astronaut. Even though the astronauts were saying in no uncertain terms that they could take 14 Gs, they wanted to go, because they knew every moment they delayed added the chance that Russia would put a man in space first. Well, the next Mercury Redstone was unmanned, and that gave just enough time for the first man in space to be Yuri Gagarin on Vostok 1. Alan Shepard would not leave in Mercury Redstone 3, which he named Freedom 7, until a few weeks later. But in this mission, now that the spacecraft is outside the atmosphere, the astronaut takes manual control, testing yaw, pitch, and roll, followed by a combination of all three, verifying that the astronaut could indeed control his spacecraft. It should be noted that the first Mercury Redstone, or Mercury capsule to be flown by astronauts, did not have the customary window. This is something that would be added on the second suborbital flight, flown by Gus Grissom a few months later, testing not only that the first mission was not a fluke, but answering the engineering questions and testing the orbital version of the Mercury before actually taking it into orbit. And in the final test of all 3 axes, the astronaut would then place the spacecraft into alignment for re-entry. I'm having a little more difficult time controlling this thing than I should. But once aligned for re-entry, the retro rockets connected to the bottom ignite and begin to slow descent. Now, retro fire is not really necessary for a suborbital flight, but it is necessary to test it anyway. And in fact, the actual vehicle does not fire all 3 at once. They fire one at a time. But once all of the retro rockets are ignited, the retro pack is jettisoned, leaving the heat shield now exposed. At this point, Alan Shepard would switch to fly-by-wire, which means he would control the path of the craft through inputted commands rather than utilizing hand controls. So basically a non-manual re-entry, but not controlled from the ground. And Alan Shepard's flight was indeed successful, as was Gus Grissom in spacecraft Liberty Bell 7, Mercury Redstone 4. It should, though, be noted that the suborbital version of the spacecraft had a quick-release hatch that was operated by a latch that would pull it free. This latch added too much weight and was replaced instead with explosive bolts that would be activated by a simple press of a control button. Well, after the spacecraft hit the water, the hatch blew and the capsule started to sink. Fortunately, Grissom was able to escape, but the vehicle was lost. And for a long time it was theorized that Grissom had panicked and blown the hatch early. And when the spacecraft was finally recovered in 1999, the film magazines on board had been exposed to seawater and were therefore useless, so they could not actually determine this visually. But one of the following astronauts, Wally Schirra, after his spacecraft was recovered, manually triggered the hatch release on the deck of the carrier and showed that activating this switch would leave a noticeable bruise. This bruise was not seen anywhere on Grissom's body, which suggested that he did indeed not activate the switch. The nose cone separates and would normally be pulled free by a drogue parachute, followed by the main chute for final descent. That was close. Well, furthermore, it was determined that the lanyard outside of the spacecraft to manually blow the hatch by recovery forces from outside was only secured by a single bolt. And the theory was that this bolt had been rattled loose by the rough seas and triggered the hatch to blow. This mechanism would of course be replaced in later spacecraft. And this is, again, a theory. It was a hypothesis that was tested in laboratory experiments and proven that it could indeed happen, which in turn became a theory therefore. But there's been no definite absolute proof that Grissom did indeed not blow the hatch manually. But all of the actual evidence suggests that he did not, and that he was telling the truth. It is unfortunate that later vehicles, namely the Apollo, did not have an explosive escape hatch. Instead, the first version of Apollo had an inward opening hatch, and this invariably caused the life of astronaut Gus Grissom, as well as Ed White and Roger Chaffee in the fire of Apollo 1, when an explosive hatch could have saved his life. However, his mission in Mercury Redstone 4 was a success, as well as the first flight of Gemini. And the 2 suborbital missions of Mercury Redstone were a success, paving the way for the upcoming orbital flights. It is at this point, after the parachute fully deploys, that the heat shield would be jettisoned and the landing bag underneath would inflate, ensuring the spacecraft keeps buoyancy when it reaches the ocean, standing by for recovery forces. A very simple space mission, primarily as a test flight to ensure capability before orbital flights were attempted. Not very glorious of mission, but no less important, and no less a very necessary step in the flight plan of Mercury to accomplish its mission, to place men in orbit and bring them home alive. And splashdown is successful. And next time we will continue with the Mercury program with the larger and tricky Atlas. This is K1. Thank you for joining me for this episode of KerbalOdyssey for the Mercury Redstone here on SciMAX TV, the sci-fi view of the universe.